The champagne glass slipped from my trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor of Moonlight Gardens as I stared at the man standing in the venue's entrance. Jake Thompson, my ex-boyfriend of 3 years, stood frozen in his expensive California suit, his face a mask of pure devastation as he took in the scene before him. White roses and fairy lights decorated every surface. 200 guests filled the reception hall, and there I was, Sarah Mitchell, in my flowing wedding dress, my hand intertwined with his best friend Michael Rodriguez, my new husband. Look in Jake's eyes wasn't just shock or surprise. It was the complete and utter destruction of a man who had built his entire future on the assumption that some things would always remain constant, that some people would always be waiting exactly where he left them. He had returned from Silicon Valley, expecting to find his old life perfectly preserved, ready to be reclaimed like a bookmark holding his place in a story he thought he could resume at will. Instead, he walked into the final chapter of a completely different book. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The silence that followed Jake's arrival felt eternal, though it probably lasted only seconds. The string quartet continued playing their soft melody, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding near the entrance. Guests chatted and laughed, sipping cocktails and admiring the sunset views of Lake Travis through the venue's floor-to-ceiling windows. Most people hadn't even noticed Jake's arrival, but those who had were beginning to whisper, their conversations trailing off as they recognized the gravity of what was happening. Mike's hand tightened around mine, a protective gesture that spoke volumes about how far we had come together. 3 years ago, Mike had been the loyal friend who held me while I cried over Jake's departure, the steady presence who helped me rebuild my shattered confidence, the patient man who waited months before even suggesting we might be more than friends. Now, he was my husband, my partner, my choice, and he was watching his former best friend's world collapse in real time. Jake's mouth opened and closed several times, as if his brain couldn't process the information his eyes were delivering. Wasn't supposed to be how his triumphant return to Austin played out. He had probably envisioned walking back into town as a successful tech entrepreneur, the one who had taken the risk and made it big in California, ready to reclaim everything he had left behind. Sarah would be impressed by his success, grateful that he had finally come back for her, eager to hear about his adventures in Silicon Valley and his plans for their future together. The reality was crushingly different. Sarah had grown up, moved on, and built a beautiful life without him. More devastating than losing me to a stranger would have been, Jake was confronting the fact that he had lost me to the person who knew him best, who had witnessed every moment of his relationship with me, who understood exactly what he had walked away from and had chosen to treasure it instead of abandoning it. Chen, my maid of honor, was the first to recover from the shock. She stepped forward with the practiced grace of someone who had spent months helping me plan this perfect day and wasn't about to let anything derail it. Emma had been there through Jake's departure, through my heartbreak, through the slow and careful beginning of my relationship with Mike, and through every moment of doubt when I wondered if I was betraying some unspoken loyalty by falling in love with my ex-boyfriend's best friend. Jake, Emma said with carefully controlled politeness, her voice carrying just enough warmth to avoid creating a scene but not enough to suggest he was welcome at this particular celebration. What a surprise to see you here. Didn't realize you were back in town. Her words were perfectly chosen, acknowledging his presence while making it clear that his appearance was unexpected and potentially unwelcome. Jake's attention shifted, to Emma, then back to me, then to Mike, as if he was trying to solve a complex equation that didn't make sense. I got back yesterday, he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. Wanted to surprise everyone. I had no idea there was a wedding happening. I came to find Sarah because I have something important to tell her. Timing was almost cruelly ironic. Jake had spent 3 years in California building his startup, convincing investors, developing products, and creating the kind of success story that would make everyone back home proud. He had probably imagined this moment dozens of times. The grand gesture of returning home victorious, ready to sweep me off my feet with tales of his accomplishments and promises of the future they could build together with his newfound success. What he couldn't have known was that I had stopped waiting for that moment about 2 years ago. What he couldn't have anticipated was that his best friend Mike had been there for every milestone Jake had missed. Every birthday he forgot to call. For every holiday when I needed someone to remind me that I was worth staying for instead of worth leaving behind. Mike stepped slightly forward, still holding my hand, but positioning himself as a gentle buffer between Jake and me. Jake, congratulations on everything you've accomplished out there. We've all been following your success through social media and mutual friends. This isn't really the time or place for a reunion, though. And catch up properly. The suggestion was diplomatic and kind, exactly the sort of reasonable response I had fallen in love with. Mike had always been the peacemaker in our college friend group, the one who could defuse tension with humor or redirect conflict into productive conversation. Even now, facing his former best friend who clearly felt betrayed and devastated, Mike was trying to find a solution that preserved everyone's dignity. But Jake wasn't interested in dignity or diplomacy. His eyes had filled with tears that he was struggling to control, and his voice cracked when he spoke again. You married him? Actually married Mike? Sarah, I left for us. Everything I did in California was to build something we could share. The company, the success, the money. It was all so I could come back and give you the life you deserved. The assumption underlying his words was so fundamentally flawed that I felt a mixture of anger and pity wash over me. Jake had left for himself, for his ambitions, for opportunities that excited him more than our relationship had. He had made that choice freely and enthusiastically, talking for months about how this was his chance to make something of himself, to prove he could succeed in the competitive world of tech startups. I had supported his decision, even though it meant the end of our relationship, because I believed he deserved to pursue his dreams. What I hadn't signed up for was being treated like a prize that could be claimed later, after he had finished playing the game of career success. I was a person, not a placeholder, and I had every right to build my own dreams and find my own happiness, while he was busy building his empire 3,000 miles away. Jake, I said softly, finding my voice for the first time since his dramatic entrance. We broke up 3 years ago. You made it very clear that California and your startup were more important than staying here with me. I respected that choice, and I moved on. Mike and I have been together for 2 years. We got engaged 6 months ago. This isn't some impulsive decision or rebound relationship. This is my life now. The words seemed to hit him like physical blows. Jake stumbled backwards slightly, reaching out to steady himself against the wall. Several guests had begun to notice the commotion now, and I could see phones being discreetly pulled out to record what was clearly becoming a dramatic confrontation. The last thing I wanted was for my wedding day to become fodder for social media gossip, but I also couldn't ignore the fact that Jake was falling apart in front of everyone I cared about. But you loved me, Jake said desperately, his voice carrying across the reception hall in a way that made several conversations stop entirely. We had plans. We talked about marriage, about building a life together. I know I left, but I always planned to come back. I thought you knew that. I thought you would wait. The entitlement in that statement took my breath away. Jake had expected me to put my life on hold indefinitely while he pursued his adventures, to remain emotionally and romantically available for whenever he decided to return to function, as a security blanket that would always be there to comfort him when his other pursuits lost their appeal. He had never explicitly asked me to wait, never made any promises about returning, never even maintained regular contact after the first few months of his departure. Mike's father, Bob Thompson, who had been chatting with other guests near the bar, noticed the disturbance and began making his way over with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to handling difficult situations. Bob was a retired military officer who had welcomed me into his family with open arms, treating me with the kind of paternal affection I had always craved. He had walked me down the aisle earlier that evening when my own father couldn't make it from his deployment overseas, and I knew he wouldn't tolerate anyone disrupting his son's wedding celebration. Jake, Bob said firmly, reaching our small group and immediately assessing the situation with military precision. I think you need to step outside and collect yourself. This is Mike and Sarah's wedding day, and you're causing a scene that's not fair to anyone involved, especially yourself. Jake looked at Bob with the same confused desperation he had been directing at me, as if he couldn't understand why the entire world hadn't remained frozen in place during his absence. "Mr. Thompson, I just need to talk to Sarah for 5 minutes. If I could just explain what really happened, why I had to leave, what I've accomplished, she would understand that everything I did was for us." "There's no misunderstanding," I said, my voice stronger now as the initial shock wore off and was replaced by a growing sense of protective anger. "You chose your career over our relationship. You left Austin, you left me, and you moved on with your life. I did the same thing. The difference is that I found someone who chose to stay. Someone who chose me every single day instead of choosing me only when it was convenient." The comparison between Jake and Mike was stark and undeniable. While Jake had been chasing Silicon Valley dreams and networking with investors, Mike had been helping me through the worst period of my life. When I lost my job due to company downsizing 8 months after Jake left, Mike had been the one to drive me to interviews, help me update my resume, and remind me of my worth when rejection letters piled up. When my grandmother died and I couldn't afford to fly home for the funeral, Mike had quietly arranged and paid for the travel without making me feel like a charity case. When I finally landed my dream job at Creative Solutions Marketing, Mike had been genuinely thrilled for my success, celebrating my achievements as if they were his own. When I decided to take a risk and ask for a promotion that seemed beyond my experience level, Mike had spent hours helping me prepare my presentation, believing in my capabilities even when I doubted myself. When I got the promotion and the raise that came with it, Mike had been the one planning the celebration dinner and bragging about my accomplishments to anyone who would listen. Jake had been absent for every milestone, every crisis, every moment. When I needed someone to believe in me or catch me when I fell, he had chosen his path freely and enthusiastically, sending occasional updates about his startup's progress, but never asking about my life, my goals, my struggles, or my dreams. The few times we had spoken during his first year in California, the conversations had been entirely focused on his experiences, his challenges, his excitement about the opportunities he was pursuing. "Sarah, please," Jake said, his voice breaking. "Entirely now. I know I made mistakes. I know I should have handled things differently. But I never stopped loving you. Everything I've built out there, it's all meaningless without you to share it with. I have money now. Real money. I can give you anything you want. We can travel, buy a house, start a family, anything you've ever dreamed of." The offer was as insulting as it was desperate. Jake was essentially trying to purchase my affection with the success he had achieved while abandoning me, as if 3 years of my emotional growth and life choices could be erased with the promise of financial security. He still saw me as the same person he had left behind, someone whose primary motivation would be material comfort rather than genuine partnership and emotional connection. "I already have everything I want," I replied, looking at Mike with the kind of love that had grown slowly and steadily over 2 years of shared experiences, mutual support, and consistent choice to prioritize our relationship above individual ambition. "I have a husband who chose me over every other opportunity that came his way. I have a partner who celebrates my successes instead of competing with them. I have someone who shows up every day instead of expecting me to wait indefinitely for his grand return." The crowd around us had grown larger, with guests beginning to form a loose circle around our conversation. Emma was trying to subtly encourage people to return to their drinks and conversations, but the drama was too compelling for most people to ignore. Lisa Rodriguez, Mike's sister and one of my bridesmaids, had appeared at my other side, offering silent support with her presence. Jake's face cycled through emotions so rapidly it was difficult to track them all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Disbelief gave way to anger. Anger transformed into bargaining. Bargaining collapsed into desperation. "This is my best friend," he said suddenly, pointing at Mike with an accusatory finger. "My best friend. How could you do this to me? How could you steal my girlfriend the minute I left town?" The accusation was so unfair and historically inaccurate that Mike's usual calm demeanor finally cracked slightly. "I didn't steal anyone," he said firmly. "You left. You ended your relationship." with Sarah and moved across the country to pursue your dreams. Sarah and I didn't even start dating until more than a year after you left, and only after months of both of us feeling guilty about developing feelings for each other because of our loyalty to you. Mike's honesty about our timeline was something I loved about him. He had never tried to minimize Jake's importance in our history or pretend that our relationship had developed without complications. When we first admitted our mutual attraction, we had spent weeks discussing whether pursuing a relationship would be betraying Jake. Even though he had been gone for over a year and had shown no signs of planning to return, we had ultimately decided that our loyalty to Jake didn't require us to sacrifice our own happiness indefinitely, especially since he had made it clear that his priorities lay elsewhere. We had started dating slowly and carefully, always conscious of the complexity of our situation, but committed to building something honest and sustainable, rather than rushing into a relationship born from rebellion or rebound emotions.
You were
supposed to be my friend, Jake said to Mike, his voice filled with a betrayal that seemed disproportionate to the actual circumstances. Friends don't move in on each other's girlfriends. There's a code, an understanding. You violated everything. Our friendship meant you left, Mike repeated, his own voice rising slightly as years of suppressed frustration finally found expression. You didn't just leave Sarah, you left all of us. You stopped returning calls, stopped visiting when you came back to town for. Holidays stopped being part of our lives except for the occasional social media update about your latest business success. You can't abandon your friendships for 3 years, then show up demanding that everyone preserved your place exactly as you left it. The truth in Mike's words was uncomfortable, but undeniable. Jake's departure for California had been about more than just ending our romantic relationship, had systematically distanced himself from everyone in Austin, treating his old life like something he had outgrown rather than something worth maintaining alongside his new adventures. A friend group had gradually adapted to his absence, growing closer to fill the gap he had left behind. James Parker, another member of our original college crew, had approached our group during the confrontation and was now standing awkwardly nearby, clearly torn between loyalty to an old friend and respect for the current situation. Been the one to introduce Jake and me originally. And he'd also been one of the first people to support my relationship with Mike when we finally went public with it. Jake, man, James said carefully, maybe this isn't the best time for this conversation. Everyone's emotions are running high, and this is supposed to be a celebration. Why don't we all meet up tomorrow when things are calmer and we can talk through everything properly? But Jake was beyond reasonable suggestions now. The careful control he had maintained during his years of building business, relationships, and managing investor expectations had completely crumbled under the weight of this unexpected emotional devastation. 3 years, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. I spent 3 years building something meaningful, something that would make everyone proud, something that would prove I was worth waiting for, and you replaced me with him. The word replace stung because it revealed how fundamentally Jake misunderstood both my relationship with him and my relationship with Mike. I hadn't replaced Jake with, like substituting one item for another. In a shopping cart, I'd grieved the end of my relationship with Jake, learned from the experience, grown as a person, eventually found love with someone who wanted the same things I wanted and was willing to work for them consistently. Mike wasn't Jake's substitute. He was his own person with his own qualities, his own dreams, his own way of loving and being loved. What I felt for Mike was different from what I had felt for Jake. Not better or worse necessarily, but definitely more mature, more stable, more grounded in reality rather than fantasy. The tension in Moonlight Gardens had reached a breaking point when Dr. Amanda Foster, our wedding coordinator, appeared with the professional composure that had made her Austin's most sought-after event planner. Amanda had orchestrated hundreds of celebrations over her 15-year career, and she possessed an almost supernatural ability to navigate family drama, vendor disasters, and emotional meltdowns while maintaining the serene atmosphere her clients paid premium prices to achieve. Mr. Thompson, she said to Jake with the kind of firm politeness that brooked no argument, I'm going to need you to step into the garden courtyard with me for a moment. We can't have this conversation continuing in the reception hall. tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult personalities and protecting her events from disruption. Jake looked around the room as if suddenly realizing that his emotional breakdown was being witnessed by 200 wedding guests, many of whom were now openly staring, and some of whom were definitely recording the drama on their phones. The reality of his public humiliation seemed to hit him all at once, and for a moment, his face crumpled with an embarrassment that was almost as devastating as his heartbreak. "This isn't over," he said to me, but his voice lacked conviction. Now, the fight was draining out of him as quickly as it had erupted, leaving behind the hollow exhaustion of someone whose carefully constructed fantasies had just collided with immovable reality. He allowed Amanda to guide him toward the exit, but not before shooting one last wounded look at Mike that contained years of betrayal and confusion. As Jake disappeared through the French doors leading to the garden, the reception slowly began to return to normal. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. The string quartet started playing again. Servers began circulating with fresh champagne to replace the glasses that had been abandoned during the confrontation. But I could feel the undercurrent of excitement and speculation that would fuel gossip for months to come. Emma immediately appeared at my side with a fresh glass of champagne and the kind of protective energy that had made her my closest friend since our freshman year at the University of Texas. Emma Chen had been my roommate, my study partner, my confidant through every relationship, disaster, and career triumph of the past decade. She had witnessed my entire relationship with Jake from its hopeful beginning to its painful end, and she had been equally present for the slow and careful development of my love for Mike. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, her dark eyes scanning my face for signs of emotional damage. Emma had a master's degree in psychology and worked as a counselor for at-risk teenagers, which made her exceptionally skilled at reading emotional states and providing exactly the kind of support people needed during crisis moments. "I think so," I replied honestly, surprised to discover that I was telling the truth. The initial shock of seeing Jake had been overwhelming, but now that the confrontation was over, I felt more relieved than shaken. I knew this moment might come eventually, just didn't expect it to happen on my wedding day. Mike's hand found mine again, his fingers intertwining with my own in the automatic gesture of connection that had become second nature over our 2 years together. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I never imagined Jake would show up like this. If I had known he was back in town, I would have reached out to him before the wedding, given him time to process everything privately. The apology was so typical of Mike's character that it made my heart ache with love for him. Even in the aftermath of being publicly confronted and accused by his former best friend, Mike's first instinct was to consider how he could have handled the situation more thoughtfully. He was the kind of person who took responsibility for other people's feelings, even when their reactions were completely unreasonable. "This isn't your fault," I assured him, standing on my tiptoes to kiss his cheek. "Jake made his choices 3 years ago, and we made ours. We don't owe him an explanation for building a life together while he was busy building his empire in California." Lisa Rodriguez, Mike's younger sister, joined our small circle with the fierce protectiveness that characterized her approach to family loyalty. Lisa was a criminal defense attorney who specialized in high-stakes cases, and she possessed the kind of sharp intelligence and quick thinking that made her formidable in courtroom battles. She had also become one of my closest friends over the past 2 years, treating me like the sister she had always wanted rather than just her brother's girlfriend. "That was incredibly selfish and inappropriate," Lisa said with the controlled anger of someone who was choosing her words carefully to avoid saying something she might regret later. "Jake had no right to ambush you like that, especially not at your wedding. If he wanted to have a conversation about the past, he should have reached out privately instead of creating a public spectacle." Bob Thompson, Mike's father, returned from escorting Jake to the garden courtyard with the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully managed a potentially explosive situation. Bob was a retired Air Force colonel who had spent 30 years dealing with personnel conflicts and diplomatic crises, skills that translated surprisingly well to civilian life and family management. "Jake's sitting in the garden with Amanda," Bob reported. "She's keeping him company while he cools down. She's also making sure he doesn't try to come back into the reception." I think the reality of what just happened is starting to sink. "And for him? How did he seem?" Mike asked. and I could hear the genuine concern in his voice, despite everything that had just transpired. This was the fundamental difference between Mike and Jake that had become clear to me over the years. Mike's first instinct was always to consider other people's well-being, even when they had just caused him pain or embarrassment. Devastated, Bob admitted with the blunt honesty that military service had taught him. I think he genuinely believed that Sarah would be waiting for him to return, that all of his old relationships would be exactly as he left them. The shock of discovering otherwise was more than he was prepared to handle. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Karen Mitchell, my older sister, who had flown in from Denver for the wedding. Karen was a successful financial advisor who had built her career on helping people make smart long-term decisions. And she had been one of my strongest supporters during the difficult period after Jake's departure. She had also been instrumental in helping me recognize that my feelings for Mike were genuine and worth pursuing despite the complicated history. I just heard about the drama from 3 different people, Karen said, wrapping me in a protective hug that smelled like her expensive perfume and familiar comfort. Are you holding up okay? Do you need me to go have a conversation with this ex-boyfriend who thinks he can show up and disrupt your wedding day? Karen's offer was both touching and terrifying, considering that she had a black belt in Taekwondo and a sharp tongue that could reduce grown men to tears when she was defending someone she loved. During my breakup with Jake, she had been ready to fly to California and personally explain to him exactly what she thought of men who abandoned loving relationships for career opportunities. I'm fine, I assured her, though I appreciated her willingness to go to battle on my behalf. Jake is dealing with his own shock right now. I think the reality of the situation is probably punishment enough. I still can't believe he had the audacity to show up here without warning, Emma said, shaking her head in disbelief. What kind of person thinks it's appropriate to interrupt someone's wedding to declare their feelings? It's like something out of a bad romantic comedy, except this is real life with real consequences. The comparison to romantic comedies wasn't far off, and it highlighted one of the fundamental problems with Jake's approach to relationships and life in general. He had always been attracted to grand gestures and dramatic moments, treating life like a movie where the right speech at the right time could change everything. When we were dating, I had found this quality charming and exciting. But I had also gradually realized that it was often a substitute for the kind of consistent daily effort that actually sustained relationships. Mike, by contrast, had never made a grand gesture in his life, but he had made thousands of small choices that demonstrated his commitment and care. He remembered my coffee order without being asked. He noticed when I was stressed about work and found quiet ways to help. He celebrated my successes without making them about himself, and he had spent 2 years proving that he was someone I could depend on regardless of circumstances. James Parker approached our group with the hesitant demeanor of someone who wasn't sure whether he would be welcome in the conversation. James had been Jake's roommate during our senior year of college, and he had maintained a closer relationship with Jake than most of our friend group during the California years. I suspected he might have insights into Jake's mindset that the rest of us lacked. I'm really sorry about all of this, James said, directing his apology to both Mike and me. I knew Jake was back in town, but I had no idea he was planning to find Sarah. He told me he wanted to surprise everyone, but I thought he meant he was planning to show up at our usual coffee shop hangout, not crash your wedding.
Oh.
Did he say anything about his expectations? Mike asked carefully. I mean, did he indicate that he thought Sarah would still be available? Or that he expected to pick up where you guys left off 3 years ago? James shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to share information that might be hurtful but understanding. That honesty was probably necessary under the circumstances. He's been talking for months about coming back to Austin and reclaiming his life, as he put it. I think the success of his startup made him feel like he could finally return as the person he always wanted to be, successful enough to deserve everything he had left behind. The phrase, reclaiming his life, was revealing in its entitlement and its fundamental misunderstanding of how relationships and time actually worked. Jake seemed to view his life in Austin as something he owned, rather than something he participated in. A collection of assets that would remain available for his eventual return, rather than a dynamic network of relationships that would evolve and change in his absence. He never asked about Sarah specifically. Emma inquired with the sharp curiosity of someone trained to identify patterns of thought and behavior. In 3 years of friendship, he never once asked whether she was dating anyone or how she was. Handling the breakup? That's the thing, James said, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Jake didn't really ask about any of us very much. When we talked, it was mostly about his business, his investors, his plans for expansion. I think he assumed that everyone back home was just waiting for him to return and tell us about his adventures. The picture James was painting aligned perfectly with my own experience of Jake's communication style. During the first year after his departure, our occasional phone calls had been dominated by his excitement about California, his networking successes, his meetings with potential investors. He had seemed genuinely surprised when I eventually stopped initiating contact, as if it had never occurred to him that relationships required reciprocal effort and mutual interest. "Did he mention Mike at all?" I asked, curious about whether Jake had considered the possibility that his best friend might have developed feelings for his ex-girlfriend during his prolonged absence. "Only in passing," James admitted. He would ask about the old gang sometimes, but it was always in the context of planning some big reunion when he came back. He talked about Mike like he was a piece of furniture that would still be in the same place when he returned, loyal and unchanging, and ready to resume their friendship exactly where it had left off. The metaphor was unfortunately accurate. Jake had treated all of his Austin relationships like furniture, valuable possessions that could be stored away safely, while he pursued other interests and retrieved later when he was ready to use them again. The idea that people might grow, change, form new attachments, or make different choices during his absence seemed to have never seriously occurred to him. Dr. Amanda Foster peered through the garden doors with the composed efficiency that had made her worth every penny of her substantial fee. "Jake has agreed to leave the premises," she announced quietly to our group. "It's called a rideshare, and he'll be gone within the next few minutes. He asked me to give you this." Amanda handed me a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been hastily torn from a notebook. I stared at it for a moment, unsure whether I wanted to read whatever message Jake had felt compelled to leave behind. The rational part of my mind knew that nothing he could say would change the reality of my marriage or my feelings for Mike. But curiosity and a lingering sense of compassion for someone who was clearly suffering made me unfold the paper. Message was written in Jake's familiar handwriting, the same script that had filled love notes during our college relationship and goodbye cards when he left for California. "Sarah, I know I handled this badly. I never meant to ruin your special day. I just need you to know that everything I've accomplished was motivated by the hope that I could come back and be worthy of you. I understand now that I waited too long and missed my chance. I hope Mike makes you as happy as you deserve to be. I'm sorry for everything, Jake." The note was heartbreaking in its sincerity and devastating in its complete failure to understand the fundamental issues with his approach to our relationship. Jake still believed that worthiness was something that could be achieved through external success rather than demonstrated through consistent choice and daily commitment. He still thought in terms of chances and timing rather than recognizing that love was not a prize to be won, but a partnership to be built and maintained. "What does it say?" Mike asked gently, his voice free of jealousy or possessiveness. He was asking out of concern for my emotional state rather than suspicion. About Jake's intentions, another small demonstration of the trust and security that characterized our relationship. "An apology," I said simply, folding the note and slipping it into the small purse I had been carrying. "And a goodbye." The finality of that statement seemed to release some of the tension that had been gripping our entire wedding party since Jake's dramatic entrance. Conversations began to flow more naturally. Laughter returned to the reception hall. The carefully planned celebration resumed its intended rhythm. But I could see in Mike's eyes that he understood this was just the beginning of a conversation we would need to have privately, away from the well-meaning concern of our families and friends. Emma squeezed my hand one more time before stepping back to give Mike and me some space. "I'm going to go charm your great-aunt Dorothy and make sure she doesn't spend the rest of the evening asking uncomfortable questions about that young man who caused such a fuss," she said with the kind of diplomatic skill that made her an excellent maid of honor. As our friends and family gradually dispersed back to their conversations and celebrations, Mike and I found ourselves alone for the first time since Jake's appearance. The string quartet was playing a soft waltz. Couples were dancing on the designated dance floor. The evening light streaming through the windows created the kind of romantic atmosphere that Amanda Foster specialized in creating. "Do you want to talk about what just happened?" Mike asked, his voice careful and gentle. "Or would you prefer to focus on enjoying the rest of our wedding reception?" I considered the question seriously, weighing my need to process the emotional upheaval against my desire to preserve the joy and celebration of our wedding day. "I think," I said slowly, "that we should dance. We should cut our cake, we should give our speeches, and we should celebrate the fact that we chose each other despite all the complications in history and expectations that other people had for our lives." Mike's smile was radiant with relief and love. "I think that's perfect," he said, extending his hand to lead me on to the dance floor. "But Sarah, I want you to know that if you need to talk about Jake, about what he said, about what this means for us, I'm here, not going anywhere." The promise was simple and profound, exactly the kind of steady reassurance that had made me fall in love with Mike in the first place. As we began to dance to the music that Amanda had carefully selected for our first dance as a married couple, I felt the last of my anxiety about Jake's unexpected appearance dissolve into gratitude for the man I had chosen to marry. The rest of the evening unfolded with the magical quality that made wedding days memorable. We cut our cake while our families cheered and cameras flashed. We gave speeches that made people laugh and cry, and we danced until the string quartet was replaced by a DJ who played music from our college years. By the time the reception ended and we said goodbye to the last of our guests, Jake's dramatic appearance felt like something that had happened in a different lifetime. But as Mike and I drove away from Moonlight Gardens toward the downtown hotel, where we would spend our wedding night before flying to Hawaii for our honeymoon, I knew that Jake's return to Austin had changed something fundamental about our story. The chapter of my life that included him had been officially closed in the most dramatic way possible. But it had also been witnessed by everyone we cared about, creating a shared memory that would become part of our marriage's origin story. "Are you okay?" Mike asked as we pulled into the hotel parking garage, the question that had become a refrain throughout the evening. "I'm perfect," I replied, and I meant it completely. I'm married to the right person. I'm starting the life I actually want, instead of the life someone else planned for me. And I'm finally free from wondering what would happen if Jake ever came back to Austin. The relief in Mike's expression told me that he had been carrying some of the same uncertainty, some of the same quiet worry that Jake's eventual return might complicate our relationship or make me question my choices. Now, that possibility had been definitively resolved, not through avoidance or careful planning, but through the messy reality of confrontation and choice. As we walked through the elegant lobby of the hotel toward the elevator that would take us to our honeymoon suite, I realized that Jake's dramatic appearance at our wedding had actually been a gift, though not the kind he had intended to give. It had forced all of us to confront the reality of our choices clearly and publicly, removing any ambiguity about where our loyalties lay and what our priorities actually were. Jake would have to rebuild his life in Austin without the assumption that his old relationships would be available for resumption. Mike and I could begin our marriage without the shadow of unresolved history hanging over our future, and I could move forward with complete confidence that I had chosen love over obligation, partnership over fantasy, and reality over the romantic notion that waiting for someone was the same thing as loving them. The honeymoon suite at the Driscoll Hotel felt like a sanctuary after the emotional whirlwind of our wedding reception. Mike and I sat on the plush velvet sofa overlooking Congress Avenue, still wearing our wedding attire, but finally alone together for the first time as husband and wife. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it was loaded with the weight of everything that had transpired in the past few hours. I kept replaying Jake's devastated expression in my mind, the way his face had crumpled when he realized that his carefully constructed fantasy of returning triumphant to reclaim his old life had been shattered beyond repair. There was something profoundly tragic about watching someone discover that the world hadn't remained frozen in place during their absence, that other people had continued living and growing and making choices without considering his eventual return. Mike reached over and gently removed the pins from my hair, allowing the elaborate updo that had taken 3 hours to create to fall into loose waves around my shoulders. The gesture was intimate and tender, exactly the kind of quiet care that had characterized our entire relationship. He didn't ask what I was thinking about. He simply offered comfort through touch and presence, understanding instinctively that I needed time to process everything that had happened. "I keep thinking about college," I said finally, breaking the contemplative silence. "About how different Jake was then, or maybe about how different I thought he was. When we were 21, his ambition and his dreams seemed romantic and inspiring. The idea of being with someone who wanted to conquer the world felt exciting rather than exhausting." Mike's fingers found mine, intertwining our hands in the automatic gesture of connection that had become second nature over our 2 years together. "What changed?" he asked quietly, though I suspected he already knew the answer. Mike had been there for all of it, watching our relationship from the perspective of Jake's best friend, and eventually becoming someone who understood both of us better than we understood ourselves. "I grew up," I said simply. "I realized that loving someone means choosing them consistently, not just when it's convenient or exciting." Jake loved the idea of me, the role I played in his narrative about himself, but he never really saw me as a separate person with my own dreams and needs and timeline. The realization had been gradual and painful, emerging slowly over the final months of our relationship as Jake became increasingly obsessed with the California opportunity and decreasingly interested in maintaining our connection in Austin. He had started treating our relationship like something that would automatically resume when his adventure was complete, rather than something that required ongoing nurturing and mutual investment. "Do you think he genuinely believed I would wait for him?" I asked, though the question was more rhetorical than anything else. The evidence of Jake's assumptions had been clear in his shock and devastation at finding me married to someone else. Or do you think part of him knew that leaving meant losing me, and he just didn't want to acknowledge that reality? Mike considered the question carefully, his engineering mind approaching the emotional puzzle with the same methodical analysis he brought to structural problems at work. "I think Jake has always been good at compartmentalizing inconvenient truths," he said finally, convinced himself that your love for him was so strong and unique that it would survive indefinite separation and neglect. It was easier to believe that than to face the choice between his career ambitions and your relationship. The observation was perceptive and probably accurate. Jake had always possessed a remarkable ability to rationalize his decisions in ways that preserved his self-image as a good person, making reasonable choices. When he left for California, he had framed it as a temporary sacrifice that would ultimately benefit both of us. Rather than acknowledging that he was prioritizing his individual goals over our shared future, "I feel guilty," I admitted, voicing the emotion I had been trying to suppress since Jake's dramatic appearance at our reception. "Not about marrying you, not about moving on with my life, but about the fact that I'm not more devastated by his pain." When I saw him standing there looking so broken, my first thought wasn't compassion or regret. It was annoyance that he was disrupting our wedding day. Mike shifted on the sofa to face me more directly, his expression serious but understanding. "That's not guilt you should carry," he said firmly. "Jake made his choices freely and enthusiastically. You supported his decision to leave even though it hurt you. You waited a reasonable amount of time before moving on. You've built a new life based on your own values and priorities. His pain now doesn't negate the validity of your choices then." The logical part of my mind knew Mike was right, but emotions rarely followed logical patterns. I had spent 3 years learning to build a life without Jake, and seeing his devastation had triggered a complex mix of sympathy, frustration, and protective anger that was difficult to untangle. I felt sorry for him as a human being experiencing genuine suffering, but I also felt angry that he had expected me to remain emotionally available for his eventual convenience. When we first started dating, I said to Mike I was terrified that I was using you as a rebound or a replacement. I spent months analyzing my feelings, questioning whether I was genuinely attracted to you or just grateful for someone who actually wanted to stay. "Do you remember how long it took me to say I loved you?" Mike smiled at the memory, his expression soft with affection for the careful way our relationship had developed. 8 months, he said. And when you finally said it, you immediately followed it with a 20-minute explanation of why you needed to be sure you meant it. Why you weren't comparing me to Jake, and why you wanted to make sure we were building something real rather than something reactionary. The conversation had taken place in Mike's apartment on a rainy Sunday morning in February. Almost exactly 2 years after Jake's departure for California. We had been lying in bed talking about our plans for the day when the words had slipped out naturally. Almost without my conscious intention. The moment I said them, I had been flooded with anxiety about whether they were genuine or whether I was simply grateful for Mike's consistent presence and care. Mike had listened to my entire anxious monologue with patient understanding, then told me that he had fallen in love with me months earlier, but had been waiting for me to reach the same emotional place without pressure or expectation. His willingness to let our relationship develop at my pace, to prioritize my emotional healing over his own desires for deeper commitment, had been one of the things that convinced me our connection was authentic and sustainable. I needed that time, I reflected. Curling up against Mike's shoulder and breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne mixed with the faint aroma of wedding cake frosting, I needed to know that what I felt for you wasn't just gratitude or convenience, or fear of being alone. I needed to be sure that I was choosing you for who you are, not just because you were available when Jake wasn't. The distinction had been crucial for my own peace of mind and for the integrity of our relationship. I had seen too many people rush into rebound relationships that were built on the foundation of what they were escaping rather than what they were moving toward. With Mike, I had been determined to take the time necessary to ensure that our connection was based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect rather than circumstantial convenience. What convinced you? Asked, his voice curious rather than insecure. What was the moment when you knew it was real? I thought back to the specific incident that had crystallized my feelings, a seemingly ordinary moment that had revealed something essential about Mike's character and our compatibility. Do you remember when I got food poisoning from that sketchy taco truck downtown? It was about 6 months into our relationship, and I was absolutely miserable for 3 days. Mike nodded, his expression indicating that he remembered the incident clearly. You were convinced you were dying and kept apologizing for being gross and needy, he said with a fond smile. You kept trying to send me home because you didn't want me to see you at your worst? But you stayed anyway, I continued. You brought me soup and ginger ale. You held my hair back when I was sick. You cleaned my apartment without being asked. And you never once acted like taking care of me was a burden or an imposition. You just did what needed to be done because I needed help. The memory was vivid in my mind, partly because of how vulnerable I had felt, and partly because of how naturally Mike had stepped into a caretaking role without making me feel guilty or indebted. Jake had always been uncomfortable with illness and weakness, treating my occasional sickness as an inconvenience that disrupted his plans rather than an opportunity to demonstrate care and support. That was when I realized that love wasn't about grand gestures or romantic speeches, I said, voicing the insight that had shaped my understanding of healthy relationships. It was about showing up consistently, especially when showing up was inconvenient or unglamorous. Jake had always been great at the big moments, the dramatic declarations and surprise trips and elaborate gifts. But you were there for the small moments, the ordinary moments, the moments when I wasn't at my best. Mike's response was characteristically thoughtful and humble. Taking care of you never felt like a burden, he said simply. It felt like a privilege. I loved being the person you trusted to see you when you weren't performing strength or independence. I loved that you let me help you when you needed help. The contrast between Mike's and Jake's approaches to love and partnership had become increasingly clear over the years. Jake had loved the idea of being my hero, swooping in to solve problems and create magical moments that would reinforce his image of himself as a romantic and generous partner. But he had been less interested in the daily work of emotional support, practical assistance, and consistent presence that actually sustained long-term relationships. Mike, on the other hand, found joy in the mundane acts of partnership that Jake would have considered boring or beneath his attention. He remembered my work deadlines and brought me coffee when I was staying late at the office. He noticed when I was stressed about family obligations and found quiet ways to lighten my load. He celebrated my small victories with the same enthusiasm he brought to major milestones, treating my daily successes as worthy of recognition and praise. I think that's what Jake never understood about relationships, I said, articulating a thought that had been forming in my mind throughout the evening. He thought love was something you felt rather than something you did. He believed that the intensity of his emotions was sufficient proof of his commitment. Without recognizing that commitment requires daily choice and action, the insight felt important. A key to understanding not just my relationship with Jake, but the fundamental difference between romantic fantasy and sustainable partnership. Jake had been genuinely confused by my lack of availability for his grand return because he had never grasped that love was a verb rather than just a noun. Something that required ongoing cultivation rather than something that could be put on hold indefinitely. You think he'll understand that eventually? Mike asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly optimistic about Jake's capacity for emotional growth. Or do you think he'll continue to see tonight as a betrayal, rather than a natural consequence of his own choices? I considered the question carefully, drawing on my knowledge of Jake's personality and his patterns of thinking about relationships and responsibility. I think Jake will probably spend a lot of time and energy trying to figure out how to win me back, I said with a mixture of sadness and frustration. He'll analyze what went wrong, what he could have done differently, how he could convince me that his success in California proves he's worthy of a second chance. The prediction felt depressingly accurate based on Jake's historical approach. 2 problems and setbacks. When faced with rejection or failure, his instinct was always to strategize and optimize, rather than to accept and move forward. He would probably spend months developing elaborate plans to demonstrate his worthiness and commitment, never quite grasping that the fundamental issue wasn't his qualifications, but his assumption that I was a prize to be won rather than a person, with my own agency and desires. What he won't understand, I continued, is that this was never about worthiness or timing or grand gestures. It was about choice. Every day for 3 years, Jake chose his career over maintaining our connection. Every day for 2 years you chose me. The difference isn't about success or failure. It's about priorities and consistency. Mike's arms tightened around me, a gesture of both comfort and possessiveness that felt perfectly appropriate given the circumstances. I never felt like I was competing with Jake, he said thoughtfully. I felt like I was building something completely different, something that didn't depend on comparisons or competitions, but on what we created together. The observation captured something essential about our relationship that had made it feel authentic and sustainable from the beginning. Mike had never tried to replace Jake or prove that he was better than Jake. He had simply offered a different kind of partnership based on different values and priorities. Our relationship had developed its own rhythm and character rather than existing as a reaction to my previous experience. I'm grateful that Jake showed up tonight, I said, surprising myself with the admission. Not because I enjoyed seeing him in pain, but because it forced all of us to confront reality clearly. There's no more ambiguity about where anyone stands or what anyone wants. Jake knows that I've moved on completely. You know that my choice to marry you wasn't influenced by uncertainty about Jake, and I know that our marriage is based on genuine love rather than convenience or fear. The wedding day confrontation had been traumatic and disruptive, but it had also provided a kind of clarity that might have taken years to achieve through more gradual means. All of the unresolved questions about loyalty, commitment, and authentic feeling had been answered definitively in front of everyone who mattered to us. There would be no wondering, no second-guessing, no quiet speculation about what might have happened if circumstances had been different. Mike stood up from the sofa and extended his hand to help me to my feet, his expression shifting from contemplative to romantic as the emotional processing of the evening gave way to awareness of our wedding night and the celebration that awaited us. Mrs. Rodriguez, he said, with a grin that made my heart skip a beat. I think we've spent enough time talking about your ex-boyfriend on our wedding night. The title still felt new and thrilling, a linguistic symbol of the legal and emotional commitment we had made to each other in front of our families and friends. Sarah Rodriguez. Mrs. Michael Rodriguez. The name represented a choice to build a shared identity rather than simply maintaining parallel individual lives, a decision to create something new together rather than trying to preserve something that had existed separately. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Rodriguez," I replied, taking his hand and allowing him to pull me to my feet. "I think it's time to focus on our future rather than my past."
Right?
As Mike led me toward the bedroom of our honeymoon suite, I felt a sense of relief and completion that went beyond the normal happiness of a wedding night. The confrontation with Jake had been painful and awkward, but it had also marked the definitive end of one chapter of my life and the clear beginning of another. I was no longer someone who had been left behind. I was someone who had chosen to move forward. The expensive champagne that the hotel had provided as a wedding gift sat unopened on the dresser. The rose petals scattered across the bed looked like something out of a romantic movie, and the city lights of Austin twinkled through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a constellation of possibilities. Everything about the moment felt perfect, not because it was free from complication or history, but because it represented the culmination of 2 years of careful choice and consistent commitment. Mike paused at the bedroom doorway and turned to face me with an expression of such love and gratitude that it took my breath away. "Thank you," he said simply, though the words carried the weight of everything we had been through together and everything we were promising to share in the future. "For what?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "For seeing me as more than just the safe choice," he replied. "For building something real with me instead of settling for something convenient. For choosing love over nostalgia and partnership over fantasy." His words touched on the deepest fear that had plagued our relationship during its early stages. The worry that I was settling for stability rather than choosing passion. I was making a practical decision rather than following my heart. The fear had been unfounded, but it had been real enough to require ongoing reassurance and demonstration until both of us felt secure in the authenticity of our connection. "I didn't choose you because you were safe," I said, cupping his face in my hands and meeting his eyes directly. "I chose you because you made me feel like the best version of myself. I chose you because being with you felt like coming home after years of trying to fit into spaces that weren't designed for me." The metaphor felt accurate and important. My relationship with Jake had often felt like wearing clothes that were almost the right size, close enough to function but never quite comfortable enough to forget about. With Mike, love felt natural and effortless, like something I had been designed for, rather than something I had to work to achieve. As we crossed the threshold into our bedroom and Mike closed the door behind us, sealing us into our private celebration of marriage and commitment, I realized that Jake's unexpected appearance had actually been a gift, though not the kind he had intended to give. It had provided the final confirmation that I had made the right choice, that my love for Mike was genuine and complete, and that our marriage was built on the solid foundation of mutual choice rather than the shifting sand of circumstance. Night stretched ahead of us, full of promise and possibility. The first night of a marriage that had been tested by drama and strengthened by clarity. Outside our window, Austin continued its nightly rhythm of music and laughter and life. But inside our sanctuary, time seemed to slow down to allow us to savor the profound happiness of two people who had found exactly what they were looking for in each other. Jake would eventually heal from the shock of discovering that the world had moved on without him. He would probably find someone else to love, someone who was available for the kind of relationship he wanted to build. But Mike and I had found something rare and precious, something worth protecting and celebrating, something that had survived external pressure and emerged stronger for having been tested. As Mike began to carefully remove the dozens of tiny buttons that lined the back of my wedding dress, each one a small act of tender patience that perfectly captured his approach to love and partnership, I felt a deep gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. The path hadn't been straight or simple, but it had led us exactly where we belonged. Together and completely certain of our choice to build a life as partners rather than competitors or consolation prizes. The wedding dress pooled around my feet like a cloud of silk and lace, beautiful and expensive and completely irrelevant, compared to the man who was looking at me like I was everything he had ever wanted. Tomorrow we would fly to Hawaii for 2 weeks of honeymoon bliss. But tonight, we were simply Mike and Sarah Rodriguez. Newlyweds, celebrating the beginning of their life together in a city that held all of their history and all of their hopes. For the future, what's up next? You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Let's click and check them out.